Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Let us know where you are watching us because today we are going to look into the dark secrets of the Kentucky woods. A story about kindness, mystery, and findings that have been scary for a whole town for decades. In the year 1843, Kentucky still had narrow paths that wound around hills full of oak and hickory trees as roads. The mountains of the Appalachians watched over small towns in silence, off of growing tobacco and raising horses. It was a time when getting around meant depending on the kindness of strangers, especially as night fell across the valleys. People who traveled and did business knew about a farm in Harlan County, which is right in the middle of this mountainous area. A sturdy wooden hut was made in a clearing surrounded by pine trees that were hundreds of years old. Inside, two sisters fed and stayed with travelers who came across those harsh lands. Sarah and Martha Henley were. What were their names? The women looked to be between 40 and 50 years old, and always wore dark clothes and smiled so far away that they couldn't see. The land was placed in a smart way at a major intersection. On one side was the road that went from Louisville to the eastern small mining towns. In the other direction was the road that traders took to get to the Tennessee tobacco farms. Any visitor who saw the yellowish light coming in from the Henley sisters' cabin windows at dusk thought they were going to heaven. A place for him to rest, grasp something to eat, and get stronger before continuing the trip. The Harlan County Archives have records from that time that show the area was known for its rude but true hospitality. Mountain families would often let guests stay with them and trade what they had for news from the outside world and a few coins. It was a custom that went back to the first residents, and it was this unofficial network of help that made life possible in those remote mountains. The few stories that have come out describe Sarah. We saw her as a tall, thin woman whose gray hair was always pulled back into a tight bun. Martha, the youngest, had a darker complexion and didn't say much. When friends came over, she would only nod her head. Visitors were told that both of them were widows and that they had received the property of a brother who had died in a cholera epidemic many years before. The cabin was a standard example of the kind of buildings you'd find in rural Kentucky. Embedded log walls, a wooden tile roof, and a stone chimney that let out smoke all the time during the "It's cold outside." Outside, there was a small barn that could hold up to 6 horses, and there was always a pile of wood ready to be burned. Inside, there was a long wood table where people ate, and a few small rooms in the back. It was simple and clean. Not only did the rooms at the Henley Sisters Inn stand out, but so did the food. People who were traveling by went back to their own places and talked about the delicious meals they had in that lost cabin in the middle of the mountains. Full-flavored soups that were warmed up to keep the body warm on cold winter nights. When the fresh breads came out of the oven, they smelled like they were made with homemade yeast. Meats cooked with spices that no one could name but had a strong taste that stuck in people's minds. This image was exactly what drew more and more tourists to the sisters' estate. Merchants who took the road often changed their routes just to stay the night at the Harlan County cabin. Some people told tales about how Sarah and Martha were able to. They made hearty meals even when food was scarce in the area, as if they had a secret supply line that never ran out. But there was more to these stories than just what they said. It started as quiet whispers among the tourists and grew into a growing restlessness over time. Some people who stayed at the house said they had strange dreams at night. Others said they heard noises on the land after everyone had gone home, coming from an unknown location. Some people also yelled. Their talks with the sisters had been low-key, and they always happened at strange times in the early morning. In 1843, Kentucky was a place where magic and truth mixed easily. The mountains held old secrets, and families who lived alone had to come up with strange ways to stay alive. In this situation, the Henley sisters seemed like any other strange people in the area, until certain details started to fit together in a way that no one could ignore. It was the first sign that something was wrong. When a tool salesman named William Tucker came to the town of Pineville in the fall of 1843 with a scary story. For more than 15 years, Tucker had been on the same trade route, so people in the area knew they could trust him. Between Louisville and the eastern mountains, he knew every path, every family, and every inn. Tucker went to the sheriff's office that October morning with a pale face and shaking hands. He said he had stayed in the Henley sisters' cabin for 3 nights and seen. He couldn't get it out of his mind. On the second night of his stay, another visitor showed up. A young guy who looked to be about 25 years old and said his name was Samuel Morrison. He said he was going to Cumberland Gap to look for work in the coal mines. For the most part, Morrison seemed like any other boy you would see on the roads of Kentucky at that time. He was quiet and held a small bundle with his things. This is how people act when they are away from home for the first time. As always, the sisters greeted him with quiet kindness and offered him a seat at the table and a place to sleep. What William Tucker was upset about wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't see. When he woke up early the next morning to continue his trip, Samuel Morrison was nowhere to be found. He had left his bag in the corner, but it wasn't there anymore. Tucker asked the sisters where the boy was, and they answered with an eerie silence. There was no sign of his passage. It was still dark when Martha said something about him leaving too soon, but Tucker was upset about more than just the absence. The smell that came from the kitchen that morning was of flowers he couldn't place, mixed with meat being cooked that seemed stronger than usual. There was also something else. Tucker said he heard noises near the cabin at night. Sounds that sounded like someone digging in the ground, along with whispered talks between the 2 women. James Butler, the sheriff of Pineville and a practical guy, was skeptical at first as Tucker told his story. At that time, travelers went missing a lot, especially young people looking for work in the mine areas. The roads were risky. Wildlife lived there, and it was normal for people to get lost on the rough mountain trails. Furthermore, the Henley sisters had a good name in their neighborhood. Tucker was sure that something was wrong, though. What he said. He had walked that path for 15 years and had stayed in the sisters' hut more than 20 times. He had always noticed that there was an oddly large amount of fresh meat available, even in the winter when game was hard to find. He was also interested in something else. He had never seen the sisters kill animals on the land, and there were no corrals or pigsties to back up the amount of meat they served their guests. Sheriff Butler chose to do some quiet investigations. He talked to other traders who used the route often and found a pattern that was disturbing. At least 6 people have been seen in the area where the Henley sisters' house used to be in the past 2 years. All of the guys were young and traveling alone. None of their families lived in the area, so no one could look for them if they went missing. A boy named Jonathan Hartwell, who was 22 years old and had left Lexington for the coal mines of Harland, was last seen. In his last letter to his family, he said that he was going to stop at an inn in the woods. Michael was there too. O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who was 28 years old and sold home goods from farm to farm as a peddler. People who saw him last said he was getting supplies at a store in Pineville and planned to spend the night in a cabin he had seen on a previous trip. The story of Robert Carlalele, who was from a good Frankfort family, was the most interesting. 3 months ago, Carriel went missing while on a work trip. He was different from the others because he was carrying a lot of cash and gold. When they found their horse, they told the farmer that they found the animal wandering freely near their sister's land. They had seen it when a traveler had passed by a few days before and left early, leaving the animal loosely tied. It became clear to Butler that picking people was not an accident. All of them were young men traveling alone who didn't have any strong ties to the area that could help them look right away. They were the kind of people who could just vanish without making a big deal out of it. especially during a time when people couldn't talk to each other quickly and the police were busy. There was some proof, but it wasn't enough. People in the community looked up to the Henley sisters because they had never been in trouble with the law and were seen as helpful. If two old women are accused of such major crimes based only on suspicions and coincidences, it could be bad for the sheriff's job. It was at that point that Butler got information that would change the whole probe. One of the men who worked in the area to fix up roads had made a disturbing find was made in the woods near the sisters' land. Something that wasn't hidden very deep but was being shown off by the weather and fall rains. Thomas Whitfield was a simple man who fixed bridges and made sure that trails between areas could be used. He worked on a part of the road that went by the Henley sisters' farm about a half-mile away in November 1843. Getting rid of falling trees and rocks that were in the way of carts was normal work. As he dug to drain a wet area and saw that the soil there looked different. It was looser, like it had been stirred lately. His shovel hit something solid as he dug. His first thought was that it was a stone, but when he began to dig around it, he saw that it was something that shouldn't be there. The small trunk was made of dark wood and had brass locks that were starting to rust. Before carefully opening the box, Whitfield looked around to make sure he wasn't by himself. Inside, he saw a frightening collection of personal items. A lot of things like rings, coins, personal letters, and papers were kept in leather wallets. The guys whose things were found seemed to be different, and some of the names on the papers seemed to match people who had been reported missing. A letter written to Jonathan Hartwell, the 22-year-old who had left Lexington months before, was found among the things. On the cap of the silver watch were the letters Mo, which could have belonged to Michael O'Brien, the Irish street vendor. The ring with the Carroll family crest was the scariest. It belonged to Robert, the Frankfurt trader, whose horse had been found wandering near his sister's cabin. Whitfield understood right away how important what he had found was. He didn't go to school, but he knew enough to know that this box was proof of something terrible. He carefully put the container back together, marked the spot with some carefully placed stones, and quickly ran to Pineville to look for Chief Butler. Next morning, Butler looked at the trunk with two cops and Whitfield himself. The finding made his worst fears about the Henley sisters come true. Even though there was physical proof linking the disappearances to the area around the cabin, he still needed more information before taking action against two well-liked citizens. In order to do a more thorough investigation, the sheriff chose to talk to people who had. I've kept in touch with the women over the years. In that way, he learned some scary things about the Henley family's past. Sarah and Martha were not born and raised in Kentucky. They moved to the area about 10 years ago, saying they were from Tennessee. After the brother who left them the land died. But when Butler wrote to Tennessee police asking for information about the Henley family, they didn't understand what he meant. In the area where the sisters lived, there were no records of any family with that name. Said they came from. Furthermore, property records from Harland County showed that the land where the cabin stood had been bought by two women using different names 10 years before. What Butler found out about the sisters made her question everything she thought she knew about them. Who are these women really? Where did they come from? And why did they lie about who they were when they moved to Kentucky? The answer seemed to have something to do with the string of strange disappearances that had happened in Tennessee around 10, a long time ago, in an area close to the Kentucky border. Through letters to Tennessee officials, Butler found out that between 1830 and 1832, a similar inn had been opened near Nashville. It was run by two women who let visitors stay and fed them. There were stories at that time of at least 8 men going missing after being last seen in that area. At the time, there wasn't much evidence to help the investigation, and the two women who ran the inn fled before the police could catch them, ask them the right questions. It looked like there was a clear link between the cases in Tennessee and Kentucky involving missing people. The Henley sisters came up with a method that they used wherever they lived. They picked strategic spots on travel routes, built a reputation for being friendly, and then carefully picked solo travelers who wouldn't be instantly sought after as victims. Even so, Butler still had a problem. No matter how strong the circumstantial proof is, it would not be enough for a trial. They needed more clear proof, which meant they had to look into the sisters' property more thoroughly. But it would be very hard to do that without letting them know, because the hut was in a remote place where any strange movement would be easily seen. The sheriff then thought of a bad plan. They didn't know about Daniel Hayes, a young deputy who had just moved to the county but was known by him. Hayes could pretend to be a normal tourist and stay in the cabin, keeping a close eye on what was going on. The women were doing and looking for more solid proof. Butler knew her plan was risky, but she didn't see any other way to solve the case before more people went missing. Daniel Hayes was from the hills of western Kentucky and was 26 years old. He had just moved to Harland County 3 months before. He didn't have much practice with investigations, but he had 2 traits that were very important for the job Butler had planned: courage and the look of a normal traveler, tall, thin, and dressed simply, and a guarded way of acting that is common among people who are looking for work in a new country. It looked like the plan was easy. Hayes would say that he was a seed trader from Louisville who was going to the coal towns in the east. He would bring a small taste of goods with him to back up his story. He would get to the sisters' hut in the late afternoon, when it was getting dark and a smart traveler would look for a place to stay the night. Butler told Hayes to keep an eye on everything. In a sneaky way, the sisters' movements during the night, the layout of the rooms in the cabin, and any strange sounds or activities that might have shown where they were hiding proof of the crimes. More than anything else, Hayes should pay attention to the food that is given to him and try to figure out where the sisters get all of their meat. Leaving Pineville early on November 22nd, 1843, Hayes rode a borrowed horse with a bag of clothes and a small group of seeds. In bags made of cloth, he had carefully learned and remembered a story about where he came from and what happened to him. This story made him seem interesting and would explain why he was in that remote mountain area. When the young deputy got to the Henley sisters' estate, it was just before sunset. The area where the cabin stood was already being covered in long shadows from the pine trees. The stone chimney was spewing smoke, and the yellowish light from the windows gave the building that friendly feel that had drawn so many visitors over the years. When Sarah Henley opened the door, she smiled quietly, just like the other guests had said. She was a tall, thin woman with gray hair pulled back into a serious bun and eyes that looked at Hayes more closely than would be normal at a simple reception for guests. She asked him about his trip and offered him a seat at the table as a nice way to invite him in. Next, Martha Henley came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on an apron that was dirty. The girl was shorter and bigger than her sister, and her features were not as clear. Physical traits and a way of moving that suggested they were very strong. She said hello to Hayes with a nod and then went back to her work right away, leaving Sarah to talk to the guest. The home inside was just like what Hayes had heard. The long wood table, a few simple chairs, and a stone fireplace with a warm fire were all in the main room. There were doors in the back that led to the bedrooms for the guests, and a door that led to the kitchen, where strong smells of cooking food could be smelled. The walls were covered with simple things that would be found in a country home, but Hayes noticed some things that didn't make sense. Several different types of pocket watches were hung on the wall like awards or souvenirs. On a shelf next to the fireplace, a group of rings and other small personal items were set up in a way that looked like it was for decoration, but had a darker meaning. Hayes recognized some of the things in the lists Butler had made, based on what was in the buried box. They served the same kind of food that had made their inn famous at dinner. a hearty stew with big chunks of meat, warm bread straight from the oven, and veggies that looked like they were just picked, even though it was late in the season. Hayes couldn't put his finger on the meat's unique taste, which was made with herbs that made a mix that was both familiar and unsettling. Hayes asked the sisters if they raised cattle on the property to start a talk about where the food came from. Without giving too much away, Sarah answered that they had deals with nearby farmers and always got the best cuts. Hayes asked Martha if there was any hunting in the area. Martha gave him a strange look and then said, "The forest always gives us what we need." As the night went on, Hayes saw more and more signs that supported his theories. Some of the sisters' words were hard for him to understand because they were whispered. They looked like they were judging something about him as they talked. They gave him deep looks when they thought he wasn't looking at them. Before going to sleep in his small room, Hayes claimed to fall asleep while keeping an eye out for anything strange. He waited not long, hearing sounds coming from somewhere on the land around midnight. Sounds that indicated a lot of physical action, like when someone was digging or moving heavy things. Hayes didn't come inside until he was sure the girls were outside doing something, then slowly got up and walked over to his bedroom window. There was enough light from the moon that night for him to see part of the yard behind the house. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks and confirmed all of his worst fears about what was going on in this remote Kentucky mountain home. Hayes could see the two sisters working in a back area of the house that had looked like any other backyard during the day, through the foggy window in her room. Garden. But now, with the moonlight, something totally different was seen. He thought those were vegetable beds, but they were really just little mounds of fresh dirt, set up in neat rows like they were graves. While Sarah and Martha worked in silence, they moved quickly and smoothly, like they had done that task many times before. One of them had what looked like a shovel in their hand, and the other had something in a dark tarp around their waist. It made Hayes' heart beat faster when he realized how evil what. He was seeing it. This garden wasn't like any other. It was a secret graveyard where the sisters hid proof of their crimes. The young deputy didn't move while he stood by the window and thought about everything he saw. He saw at least 8 mounds of dirt that looked like new graves spread out in a line that went to the tree line. The way the spot was set up suggested a method that had been used for years, with stones or small branches arranged in a certain way to mark each grave. Hayes saw the sisters worked for almost an hour before going back inside the house. He stood by the window for a few more minutes, thinking about what he had seen and making plans for how to tell Sheriff Butler about what he had found. But first, he had to make it through the rest of the night and leave the land without anyone noticing. The next morning, Hayes got up early and got ready to leave. He tried to look like any other tourist who was excited to keep going on his trip. He was given a by Sarah Henley, a simple breakfast of bread, butter, and cold meat cuts that tasted just like the dinner the night before. During their morning talk, Hayes got the sense that his sisters were thinking about something about him, as if they were making a big choice. When it was time to leave, Martha walked into the main room, carrying a bag that she said had food and drinks for the trip. It looked like a nice thing to do, like a friendly country welcome, but Hayes noticed that the woman held the package in a strange way, as if it weren't food inside. After a polite thank you, he put the package in his bag and went to the stable to find his horse. Hayes saw Sarah watching him from the cabin door with a look she couldn't figure out while he was getting the animal ready for the trip. That look made her seem like she was trying to figure out distances and options in a dangerous way. He said goodbye with a wave, got on his horse, and walked away from walked at a pace that he thought would seem reasonable for someone who had a long day of traveling ahead of them. But as soon as Hayes lost sight of the cabin, he jerked the horse forward and raced as fast as the animal could go toward Pineville. He was sure that getting to the police before the sisters found out that he knew their secrets would save his life. The package Martha had given him was hanging out in his luggage, and he started to think that what was inside might not have been what it seemed to be. Sisters said they did. Hayes looked very upset when he finally got to Sheriff Butler's office. He told them everything he had seen during the night, including the secret graveyard and the sisters' strange behavior. Butler listened to the story with more and more seriousness. He realized he finally had enough proof to take direct action against the women. But there was something wrong. The sisters' property was in a county that was next to Butler's, so Butler would have to work with the officials in that county to set up a proper search process. The girls could also try to run away if they knew they were being watched. Following the same pattern they had used in Tennessee years before, Butler decided to move quickly. 4 brave and discreet guys from the area were put together by him, along with 2 experienced deputies. It was planned to search the whole property thoroughly early in the morning, when the sisters would be asleep. Of the reasons for the evidence of the acts. As the plans were being made, Hayes thought about the package his sisters had sent him. When he opened it in front of Butler and the other men, they saw that it didn't just have normal food inside. There was a small jar with a dark liquid that smelled like medicinal herbs but could also be something more dangerous. There were also some bits of bread and dried meat. The finding of the vial made people even more suspicious that the sisters knew how to make people unconscious. They attacked their victims before killing them. They might have put drugs in the food they served the guests, leaving them weak and unable to fight back or run away when the time came. Hayes became more aware of how close she was to becoming another target of the Henley sisters. Butler planned the operation for the next morning after gathering all the proof. 2 women who had been guilty of violent crimes in the past would be going on a dangerous mission, but it was the only way to stop a string of. People in the area had been afraid for too long because of the killings, which could go on forever if the sisters weren't caught. The operation began early in the morning on November 24, 1843. It was dark when Butler and his men left Pineville. They rode in silence along the paths that wound through the misty mountains. In late November, it was very cold, so the air was thick. Each breath made little clouds of steam that quickly disappeared in the cold air. The group split into 2, the pieces when they got close to the sisters' home. Butler, Hayes, and 2 deputies would stand at the main entrance, and the other 4 men would circle the back of the cabin, which is where Hayes had seen the secret graveyard the night before. The sisters weren't supposed to be able to get away or destroy proof before they were caught, so that wasn't the plan. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Butler and his men made their way to the house. The building. It was very quiet for that early in the morning. There wasn't any smoke coming from the chimney, and there were no signs of the usual morning things that would happen in a country house. The horses were still in the stable, but it looked like no one had been there recently because the hut looked like it had been left empty. Butler knocked on the front door and said she was the sheriff. She then told the sisters she needed them to come outside and answer some questions. After that, there was a strange quiet. He called again and again, but there was still no answer. Answer from inside the hut. Following a short wait, Butler decided to break in because she was afraid that the sisters might have left during the night, or, even worse, were destroying evidence at that very time. Considering how far away the house was, the fact that the door wasn't locked was strange. Butler was the first to walk in, then the other guys who were all armed and ready for anything. There was a lot of mess inside the house, like someone had to leave quickly. Things were flipped over. There were clear signs that things had been quickly gathered when drawers were opened. The men found even more troubling proof in the kitchen. On the table were a number of jars containing unknown substances, knives of different sizes that didn't look like normal kitchen tools, and handwritten recipes with ingredients that seemed odd. A big iron pot still had bits of something that had just been cooked in it, putting off a smell that none of the men could place, but that they all liked. Very nasty. Among the things Hayes found in a kitchen drawer were letters and papers that looked like they had been stolen from different people. It was possible for letters, employment contracts, and even wills sent to the missing men to never get to their final location. It looked like the sisters kept trophies of each victim as a way to remember the horrible things they did. But the most shocking thing that was found was when the men who had circled the back of the house started digging at the spot where Hayes had. Found to be a graveyard. It was easy to work because the ground was wet and soft, and it didn't take long for them to find the first remains. It was exactly what everyone thought would happen, but seeing proof of the crimes made things even worse. Butler figured out that the sisters had probably run away at night when they realized their plan had been found out. It was possible that they had seen something fishy about Hayes's actions during his visit, or that the people in the area had told them about the study that was going on. Anyhow, they got away again, following the same plan that had worked in Tennessee years before. The search of the property went on all day, showing how bad the Henley sisters' crimes really were. The men found 9 bodies buried in the secret cemetery. The bodies were all in different states of decomposition, which suggests that the killings happened over about 2 years. Men who had been reported missing, confirming the suspicions that led to the investigation in the first place. Investigators found what looked like a makeshift butcher shop in a smaller cabin at the back of the property that had not been seen on previous visits. There were hooks set up on the ceiling. There were dark-stained wooden tables and tools that were clearly not meant to be used for preparing normal animal meat. The discovery showed how the sisters were able to keep a steady flow of. Even in the coldest parts of winter, you can still get fresh meat. When Butler saw this case, she knew it was one of the scariest ones she had ever worked on. The Henley sisters weren't just regular killers. They were organized predators who had come up with a complex plan to find, kill, and hide their victims. They were up to much worse things behind the inn, and the reputation they had built in the area for good food came from somewhere no one could have imagined, now that the bodies and evidence have been found. After Butler got better, he organized a big search for the sisters who had run away. Notifications were sent to counties nearby, and detailed descriptions of Sarah and Martha were sent to government officials in Kentucky and nearby states. But Butler had seen the sisters do this before in Tennessee. They were good at making new identities and disappearing into remote areas where they could continue their illegal activities. People all over the Kentucky mountains heard about the crimes that were found on the Henley sisters' property, like a wildfire when it's dry. Within a few days, everyone in the area knew the gory details of what had happened in that hut that so many travelers thought was safe. People who lived alone in the mountains started to lock their doors more carefully, and merchants started to travel with other people whenever they could. The Mountain Herald, a newspaper in Pineville, put out a special edition just about the case. The editor was a man named Samuel Morrison, whose name was also that of one of the victims. They said the discovery was the worst crime ever seen in the mountains of Kentucky. The story talked about Butler's investigation and the evidence that was found on the property. It also had sketch portraits of the runaway sisters that were based on descriptions of Hayes and other guests who had made it out of the cabin alive. But the attention also led to shocking revelations. A lot of people came forward with information they had kept to themselves for years after the newspaper went around. A farmer in the county next door said he had smelled something strange coming from the direction of the sisters' property on windy nights. He said it smelled like burning flesh, mixed with something sweet and sickening. An old woman who lived in a cabin a few miles away said she saw dark smoke rising from the property at odd times, always early in the morning. Even scarier was the testimony of a 12-year-old boy who sometimes delivered supplies to the sisters as part of his job. He told her that Sarah always met him at the property's entrance, never letting him get close to the main cabin. 2 times, the boy heard strange sounds coming from the back of the house, like someone was hammering nails or digging holes. When the boy asked Sarah what the noises were, she said they were tending to the garden, but the boy said he had never seen any signs of gardening in the area where the noises were coming from. Butler put together a task force with deputies from 3 different counties to look for the runaway. Friends. The investigation showed that they had left the property on 2 horses that they had hidden in a nearby forest, most likely as a backup plan in case of an emergency. Animal tracks were followed northeast for about 15 miles, but they got lost in a rocky area where they couldn't be found. At the same time, Butler kept looking into the sisters' past to find out who they really were and where they came from. By writing to government officials in other states, he found a pattern that went much further than Kentucky and Tennessee. People in at least 4 states said the same thing about ENs run by 2 women. They always ended the same way: setting up shop on remote travel routes, getting a good name for food, and mysteriously disappearing single travelers. Butler was able to find records of the first case, which happened in Virginia in 1828. After a number of people went missing, an inn near the Blue Ridge Mountains was looked into. However, the 2 women who ran it fled before any conclusions could be made. There was proof to be found. The women's physical descriptions were pretty close to those of the Henley sisters, taking into account how people naturally age over time. From what I could tell, Sarah and Martha had been working together for at least 15 years, moving from state to state whenever their actions raised red flags. It was a trend of criminal activity that moved around and took advantage of the fact that police in different areas couldn't easily talk to each other or work together. They had become very good at hunting, improving their methods over the years until they came up with a nearly perfect way to find and kill people. Butler thought that the sisters might have killed more than 50 people during their long criminal career. That was a shockingly high number that put them among the worst crooks in U.S. history up to that point. They had been working for so long without being caught, which showed both how cruel they were and how smart they were, which made their grab even more quickly. The investigation also showed some of the ways the sisters chose the people they killed. Butler figured out that all of the victims were young men traveling alone and generally carrying money or other valuables by looking at the things that were found on the property and the bodies that were found in the secret cemetery. It looked like the sisters carefully considered each guest, picking only those who wouldn't be quickly sought after and who could provide both the money and food they needed to keep there, doing something bad. But Butler kept having a lot of trouble with one part of the case. His men found notebooks with thorough notes on each victim while they were searching the property. The sisters kept very detailed records of each person they got rid of. These records included not only basic information like name and age, but also notes about the person's behavior, fears, and last words. It looked like they were doing some kind of research on how people act when they are sad. The notebooks showed that the sisters knew a lot about plants and chemicals that could render people unconscious or poison them. Some of the notes made it sound like they tried out different approaches, as if they were getting better at them over time. There were also detailed maps of the land that showed other ways to get out and places where evidence could be quickly hidden if needed. With all of these new clues, Butler knew she wasn't dealing with normal thieves, but with women who had given their whole lives to coming up with complex ways to kill people. Not only was it the right thing to do for local justice, but it was also urgently needed to protect travelers all over the Appalachian area. Butler got a letter that totally changed the course of the investigation 3 weeks after the crimes on the Henley sisters' estate were found. The mail got there thanks to a runner who rode for 2 days from Pike County, which is even farther away and has more mountains than Harland. The source was from the area. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, who was writing about something that seemed to have something to do with the runaway sisters. According to Caldwell, two women who looked like Sarah and Martha had come to his area about a week before, saying they were widows looking for a new place to start their lives. They paid cash for a small, remote property close to the Virginia border and moved very quickly to finish the deal. What got the attention of the local government were stories that started going around about how strange the new house was acting. Neighbors who lived far away had seen strange things happening at night at the women's new home. Sounds of digging, lights moving through the forest at dawn, and the smell of something being burned at odd times. An even bigger fear was that a young trader had gone missing in the area only 3 days before the women arrived. The boy was last seen in a nearby pub, where he said he was going to spend the night in a hut he had found while on his trip. Butler knew right away that the sisters had started committing crimes again in a new place, following the same plan they had used in Kentucky, Tennessee, and other states over the years. But there was a big change this time. The officials were aware of them and knew exactly how they worked. It was a one-of-a-kind chance to catch them before they could fully set up their new business. The sheriff quickly put together a trip to Pike County, which included Hayes and 3 skilled deputies with him. It would be dangerous to go through the mountains, especially since the sisters knew they were being watched and had probably set up defenses for their new home. But Butler thought it was his last chance to catch crooks who had been getting away for too long. Riding through narrow trails that wound between rocky cliffs and thick woods took 2 full days to get to Pike. The group only stopped to rest once, in a small town called Breaks. 2 women who looked a lot like the sisters had stopped by lately to buy supplies and ask about remote homes for sale in the area, which they were able to confirm. When they finally got to Sheriff Caldwell's land, Butler was told what was going on there. The sisters bought land in a very remote area that could only be reached by a narrow trail that went up the side of a mountain covered in pine trees. The area could be defended, and it was easy to see what was going on around them. There were many ways to get out of the dense forest that went all the way to the border with Virginia. Caldwell had looked into the missing young man in a secret way, which proved that his suspicions were right. The shopkeeper, a boy named Edward Collins, who was 23 years old, had been to the sisters' house the night they went missing. A farmer living a few miles away had seen a lot more smoke coming from the area that night than someone who would normally see smoke from home activities. Helper. Caldwell and his partner made a detailed plan for how to deal with the sisters' estate. In contrast to the operation in Kentucky before, they knew exactly who they were up against this time and could plan accordingly. The group would be bigger, with 8 armed men, and they would come at them during the day, when they would be easier to see, and the sisters would have fewer chances to use the darkness to their advantage. That being said, there were problems. The property was in an area that was officially shared by West Virginia and Kentucky. Because the state lines in that mountainous area aren't always clear, any action would have to be carefully planned to avoid more legal issues. The sisters had also shown over the years that they were very good at getting away when they felt threatened, and it was possible that they had planned escape routes even in their new home. Butler went over everything she knew about the sisters and how they worked the night before the planned surgery. They were criminals with more than 15 years of experience had been working successfully for years, always changing with the times and keeping one step ahead of the police. To catch them, you would need to be brave and determined, and you would also need a plan that took their knowledge and resources into account. Hayes, who had lived through the last meeting with the sisters, gave useful information about how they behaved and what they did with their old stuff. He suggested that the plan be put together from a number of directions at the same time, making it impossible to get out through the routes that the sisters had probably dug. He also said to be very careful with any food or drinks that might be on the land. The sisters showed a lot of knowledge about dangerous chemicals, so the operation was set to start at dawn. Butler knew going up against crooks who had spent their whole lives killing people in a planned way would be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. But he also knew it was the only way to. Make sure that the Henley sisters, or whatever their real name was, didn't hurt anyone else. Too long had passed without justice being done, and now it was time for a final reckoning in the dark Appalachian woods. There was a thick fog over the mountains in Pike County at dawn on December 15, 1843. It looked like a ghostly blanket. Prior to sunrise, Butler and his men set up camp around the land the sisters had bought in a planned way. The new house was built on a natural rise. That gave a good view of the hills around it, but also left it open to a well-planned siege. In contrast to the previous property in Kentucky, this new site showed signs of being ready for defense. The sisters had cut down trees to make it easier to see, used logs to make makeshift walls, and dug shallow ditches around the hut. The fact that they were ready for a fight showed that they hoped to be found eventually. Butler made 3 groups out of his guys. He would be at the front of the line. 3 deputies, and Caldwell would surround the property with 2 guys from the area on the west side. Along with 2 other helpers who knew the area well, Hayes would be in charge of blocking the most likely way to get out from the east side. The goal was to either get the sisters to give up or stop them from running away again. As the first rays of sunshine broke through the fog, Butler moved closer to the cabin. In contrast to the last operation, he yelled his name from a safe distance this time, telling the sisters they have to leave with their hands up to face the charges against them. He heard the answer in the form of a rifle shot that went right by his head. He could hear the whistle as the bullet cut through the air. It was clear that the sisters were not going to give up quietly. Butler and his men hid behind rocks and trees and fired back in a controlled way. The shooting that followed was fierce but short, and the sisters had surprisingly good aim for. People in their 30s and 40s. It was clear that they knew how to use guns, which is another skill they had learned while they were criminals. During a break in the gunfire, Butler heard voices coming from the house. The sisters were speaking quickly with each other, as if they were discussing their choices. He used the time to shout an offer. The police would follow the law and give them a fair trial if they turned themselves in willingly. If they kept fighting, he couldn't promise their safety when the force was used to solve the problem. Sarah Henley's answer rang clear and disturbing through the mountains. She yelled back that they would rather die in those mountains than go to jail for the rest of their lives. More scary was when Martha said that they had already lived longer than most people could handle, and that their work was almost done. The words had a resolve to them that let Butler know the sisters were up to more than just fighting back. At that point, Hayes, who was on the eastern, as an escape path, saw smoke coming from the cabin. The smoke wasn't like smoke from a furnace. It was denser and darker, like things were being burned on purpose. Butler saw that the sisters were getting rid of proof, which could include papers that could show how bad their crimes have been over the years. The sheriff chose to do something dangerous. He told his men to move forward at the same time from all directions, taking advantage of the fact that the sister was busy burning things. They were taking a risky move that would leave them open to enemy fire. However, destroying proof could make it impossible to hold another trial, and could leave important questions about other crimes unanswered. The sisters were caught off guard by the planned attack. Butler and Caldwell were able to get to the cabin almost at the same time, but Hayes stopped anyone from getting out. But when they forced their way into the cabin, they saw something that neither of them was ready to see. Sarah and Martha had blocked off the main. They broke in through the back door and were in the middle of the room, surrounded by stacks of burning papers. They were holding big knives like the ones Butler had seen on the last farm, and the look on their faces was almost religious in its determination. No longer were it the quiet women who took in travelers, but something much more primitive and risky. The final fight only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like it went on forever. Butler had to use his gun to defend himself when Sarah charged at him with a knife, Self-defense. Caldwell caught Martha as she tried to escape through a side window. As things got worse, the papers kept setting fire to themselves, filling the hut with thick smoke that made it hard to see and breathe. After the smoke cleared and things calmed down, Butler took a look around the destroyed house. Even though some proof had been saved from the fire, it was clear that the sisters had destroyed important records about what they had done. Still, there was enough evidence to prove his. There were doubts about how bad the crimes were, and they wanted to get a fuller picture of 20 years of planned killings. In the papers that made it through the fires, Butler found detailed maps of travel routes in several states, lists of names that seemed to match deaths, and letters from people who might have been travelers' companions or sources of information about solo travelers. There were also thorough instructions for making poisons from local plants, which confirmed what people already thought about how the sisters made their victims unable to do anything. The most upsetting thing that was found, though, was Martha's personal notebook that she had kept for years. The journal entries showed a very strange way of thinking, where killings were seen as a way to clean up society, and visitors were seen as gifts for a bigger reason that she never explained clearly. That thought was from a woman whose mind had lost all contact with normal people. After her sister was captured, Butler spent the next few days carefully, looking at the pieces of proof that were still there after the fire in the cabin. He was able to piece together some of the sisters' crimes that happened over more than 20 years by working with Caldwell and other detectives. The picture that came out was even darker than anyone had thought. Even though the fire damaged Martha's diary, it still had notes from 1825. The first pages that could be read showed that the sisters had started committing crimes in a hilly area of North Carolina near the Tennessee border. Fence. At first, it looked like they were acting out of necessity when they killed travelers to steal their money and goods. Over time, though, the reason had changed into something much scarier. The most recent notes in Martha's diary showed that she saw her crimes as part of a complicated ritual. She wrote about giving the earth food by killing people, and how each victim served a bigger purpose that she thought she was achieving. There were references to visions and dreams that helped her make her choice. She wrote in great detail about the people she killed and how she prepared their bodies before burying them in her secret graves. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be the real-world brains behind the plan. His handwriting was found on papers that showed he carefully planned where he would live changes, researched profitable journey routes, and even studied the habits of different types of travelers. She had studied murder in great detail and come up with better and better ways to do it. During the interrogations that came after the capture, the girls showed very different personalities. Most of the time, Martha kept quiet, but every once in a while she muttered something about sounds in the mountains and unfinished work. When she spoke clearly, it was to say that she was upset that she hadn't been able to finish the required amount before she was caught. Sarah, on the other hand, stayed calm and cold even while she was in jail. She dodged questions and never directly admitted to the crimes, but making it clear that she thought what she did was right. She once told Butler that people who hike alone in the woods are looking for something, and we just gave them what they were looking for. The sisters had used at least 6 different names over the years, the probe found. Along with Mary and Elizabeth Turner, Catherine and Margaret Bailey, and Rebecca and Ann Coleman, Sarah and Martha Henley were just the newest names on a long list of fake names. Each time they changed their name, they moved, always following the same pattern of setting up shop on lonely travel routes. Butler was able to draw a map of at least 8 places where the sisters had worked between 1800 and 1843. Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and maybe even some other states that weren't proven because records were destroyed. Reports came in from each place that visitors had mysteriously disappeared. Usually the same kind of person, young guys traveling alone with money or other valuables. There was a low guess that the sisters had killed between 50 and 70 people during their time as criminals. But the numbers could be even higher if you count the times when there wasn't enough information. Even experienced detectives were shocked by how bad the sisters' crimes were. They were among the most frequent killers in American history up to that point. What made their acts worse? The cold and methodical way they had done things was shocking. They didn't act out of anger or compulsion. Instead, they were smart killers who had made murder their business. They carefully planned every part of their operations, from picking sites to getting rid of bodies and selling victims' things. Butler found out that the sisters kept in touch with people who could help them sell things that they had stolen from other people. People from faraway places bought watches, jewelry, and other things. Valuable things without asking where they came from. Some of these deals were written down in papers that were saved from the fire. These papers gave clues about a larger group of people who, with or without knowledge, helped the sisters commit their crimes. The sisters' trial preparations became an event that people in the area were interested in. Big towns like Louisville and Nashville sent reporters to Pike County to cover what was being called the trial of the century in the Appalachians. The types of acts and the length of time. Of the sisters' criminal past had caught the public's attention in a way that not many other crimes could. But there were big judicial problems because the crimes happened in several states over a long period of time. It was hard to figure out which state should hold the trial. Different states' prosecutors said they had the right to bring charges against the sisters, but each said their case was more important. In the end, Kentucky was chosen as the site for the hearing because it was there that the most recent. The places where crimes had happened and where there was the most physical proof. But everyone knew that if the sisters were found guilty, they would face more charges in other states, no matter how the trial turned out. As the trial date got closer, Butler thought about how the case had affected the area. When the sisters' crimes were found out, they completely changed how people thought about mountain hospitality in the country. The custom of entertaining strangers, which had been a big part of. Appalachian society was now looked at with doubt and care. Losing that much faith was a big blow to culture, and it would take generations to fix. On March 18, 1844, Sarah and Martha's trial started at the Harlan County Courthouse. It was a small wooden building that barely had room for everyone who wanted to see the case. People from many states, including journalists and victims' families, came to see what many thought was the most important criminal trial of the decade, in the mountains of North America. William Harrison, an experienced lawyer from Frankfort, who had been brought in just for the case, was the prosecutor. He based his case on physical evidence found on the sisters' properties and the statements of witnesses who had been in contact with them. The plan was to show a clear pattern of criminal behavior that went back decades and showed abuse that was planned and carried out on purpose. Through the first part of the hearing, Harrison used Daniel Hayes as a star witness by calling him. The young deputy went into great detail about breaking into his sister's hut. He talked about what he had seen through the window at night and the proof he had found inside the house. Her evidence was very important in showing that the sisters were linked to the crimes that were later found. Thomas Whitfield, the worker who found the victims' things hidden in the trunk, also spoke in court. He talked about the finding that started the whole thing. Research, showing the jury some of the things that were found that belonged to the men who went missing. The jurors' reactions to the physical evidence were clear. Many of them seemed troubled by how the crimes were done over and over again. When Harrison showed Martha's diary to the judges, it was the most exciting part of the trial. He read out loud some passages that had survived the fire and showed how the murderers had a bad mind. Martha's writings about gifts to the land. There were screams of fear in the courtroom, showing that the crimes were caused by more than just greed. They were also caused by severe mental imbalance. Two lawyers from the area defended the sister, but they were up against a case that was almost impossible to win. His main strategy was to call into question the evidence by saying that many of the papers had been damaged by the fire and that the prosecution's interpretations were just guesses. Also, they tried to use Martha's. A mental disorder can be used as a reason for insanity, but the sisters wouldn't fully participate, which was a problem for the defense. Sarah kept her cool and calculated attitude. When her lawyers asked her questions, she gave vague answers that hurt her case more than helped it. Martha, on the other hand, would sometimes interrupt with ramblings about sounds in the mountains and work that wasn't done. During her statement, Sarah showed that she knew a lot about. There were rules and court procedures that shocked everyone in the room. It was clear that she had spent years learning about the justice system, possibly getting ready to be caught one day. When asked about the killings, she didn't directly say she wasn't involved, but she did say that what she did was important to keep the mountain's natural balance. The trial brought to light more information about the sisters' actions that had not been found in the initial probe. People who saw it said, as their old names came to light, the sisters reported seeing strange behavior that made sense in the context of the crimes. A Tennessee business owner talked about some strange deals in which the sisters sold a lot of men's personal items. What was even scarier was the story of a local doctor that the sisters had talked to years before about the healing properties of some plants. He said that they had shown they knew a lot about botanical toxicity by asking specific questions about poisoning signs and doses that are lethal. He thought at the time that they were interested in plant medicine to help sick guests, but now he knew what they were really asking. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found both sisters guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The speed with which the decision was made showed how strong the proof was and how horrible the crimes had been for the community. The judge, a very old man. A judge called Samuel Porter had been in charge of criminal cases in the mountains for more than 20 years. He said that these were the worst crimes he had ever seen in his job. The sentence came out the next morning. The crowd in the courts who were there quietly agreed with the decision that both sisters should be hanged. While listening to the sentence, Sarah didn't show any feeling. She kept the same cold face that had been present throughout the whole trial. On the other hand, Martha began to. They laugh in a disturbing way and say something about finally being able to join the sounds in the mountains. But there was one last change that would surprise everyone who was involved in the case. Unexpected things happened in the local prison the night before the execution, which was supposed to happen 2 weeks after the sentence. This totally changed what everyone thought would happen. That night's events would become just as mysterious as the acts that brought the sisters to court in the first place. The guard at night, the next morning, a trustworthy man who had worked for more than 10 years was found in a state that no one could fully explain. He was still living, but he looked like he had just been through something that had knocked him out. When he finally got the chance to talk, what he said was both upsetting and hard to understand. In spite of being locked up in different rooms and not being allowed to talk to each other, he talked about what he had heard the sisters saying to each other during the night. It talked about sounds coming. There were people in the cells who didn't look fully human, and he was sure he saw strange lights moving through the jail halls. That was scary enough, but he claimed that the voices he heard at night were those of people who had been dead for years. When Butler went to the local jail the morning of the execution, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There were no signs of escape or break-in in the cells that Sarah and Martha were meant to be in. The doors stayed open. Outside is locked. The locked windows stayed in place, and there were no tunnels or secret passages that could have led the girls somewhere else. The jailer was still shocked from what happened the night before, so he could only retell parts of what he had seen and heard. He was sure he heard the sisters talking all night, not just to each other, but also with sounds that didn't seem to be from inside the prison. He said that the talks had names of people he knew who had been victims of the killings, as if the dead were coming back for one last meeting. The prison guard said that there was complete silence in the prison about 2 hours before dawn. He could hear his own heart beating through the deep quiet. She finally got the nerve to check the cells, but all she saw were clothes nicely folded over the bunks. It looked like the sisters had just taken off their clothes and disappeared. Butler led the biggest search in the area's history, getting men from 4 different counties to look for the girls who ran away. Police dogs from Louisville were brought in, but they lost track of the sisters just a few feet from the jail, as if they had vanished into the morning air. The search went on for 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles of hilly land, but the women were not found. As the days went by with no new finds, strange stories started to spread among the people who lived in the area. Travelers said they saw 2 women walking along the trails during the full moon, but the forms always faded when someone tried to get close. Farmers said that some nights, animals would act strangely, as if they could sense ghosts or other supernatural beings nearby. The stories of people who said they had met the sisters in their dreams were even scarier. The order of these events was always the same. The sisters would show up with tasty food, but when the person tried to eat, they would wake up with a bad taste in their mouth and the feeling that they were very close to something terrible. They had such clear and vivid dreams that some people began to think that the sisters had found a way to keep doing what they were doing after they died. It was never really over with the case of the sisters from the Appalachians. It is still listed as an unexplained disappearance in Harlan County files, which was a category that always annoyed Butler until the end of his work. Over the next few years, there were a few stories of similar crimes happening in faraway mountain areas, but there was never enough proof to prove that the sister was involved. The long-term effects of the case went well beyond the area where it happened. In the Appalachian Mountains, the sisters' story has become a legend that is told from one generation to the next as a warning about the risks of depending too much on strangers' kindness. Across the area, rural guest houses started to work in different ways, paying more attention to their guests and working together more closely with the local government. Daniel Hayes would never forget that he put his life at risk to reveal the sisters' crimes, his life story. He worked as a deputy for many years, but he always said that nights with a full moon made it hard for him to sleep. In his journal, he wrote that he could sometimes still taste the strange meat he had eaten in the sisters' hut, as if the taste would never leave his mind. The sisters' first home in Harlan County was never lived in again. The house was just left to rot, and the clearing was filled back in by the trees over time. Hunters and tourists going by. People who went through the area said they felt like they were being watched all the time, especially near where the secret graveyard used to be. Some people said they could hear digging sounds at night, as if someone were still lying in that cursed land. Thomas Whitfield, the person who first found the buried chest, moved to a place far away a few months after the trial. His friends say that he avoids any trails now because of what happened, but he has never talked about it in public, that go through mountainous places that are hard to reach. People asked him about his sudden change in behavior, but all he said was something about how some places should be left alone. The result of the case didn't bring much comfort to the families of the victims who were identified. The sisters' mysterious absence left a lot of questions unanswered, even though they knew what happened to their loved ones. Some people were relieved to hear that female killers could no longer claim new victims, but others were still troubled by the idea that justice wasn't done fully. Sheriff Butler kept looking into similar cases until he retired, but he never found proof that the sisters were still alive and doing what they were doing. He often thought about the case in his later years, wondering if there were any details or clues he had missed that could have changed the result. And when he died in 1868, he took with him the sadness of never having fully solved the puzzle of the Sisters of the Appalachians. Hilly areas. The Sisters' case is still one of the scariest in American crime history, even after more than 180 years. It's a sad warning that bad things can happen anywhere, even in places that look like they are peaceful. There are many secrets in the Appalachians, but few memories are as scary as the ones of two women who turned being friendly in the country into a death trap. You've made it this far on this trip through the dark secrets. Mountain Range. Tell us in the comments where you're watching us. Please join the chat if you haven't already. Press the bell to make sure you don't miss our next reports. Let us know what part of this story really moved you.